On August 7, 1996, a 41-year-old entrepreneur named Lance Herndon woke up at 3:40 a.m. to the sound of his alarm clock going off inside of his mansion in Roswell, Georgia. The alarm was actually one of 3 alarms set to go off that morning. The first was at 3:40, the second at 3:50, and the third at 4 a.m. And this was actually how every workday began for Lance. He was the founder of an IT consulting company called Access Inc., and his borderline compulsive work ethic not only made him millions of dollars, but also it had made him a trailblazer for the Black business community in Greater Atlanta. His company, Access Inc., had actually been awarded the National Service Firm of the Year award by President George H.W. Bush. President Clinton had honored Lance with the Minority Entrepreneur of the Year award and had appointed him to the 1995 White House Conference on Small Business. Lance sat up and slammed his hand down on the clock to stop the alarm, and then shut off the other 2 alarms so they wouldn't ring. Then he threw aside his bedsheets and got up and walked over to the dresser to pull out some clothes. On top of his dresser, he kept a sexy lingerie photograph of one of his girlfriends, a woman he'd been seeing for years named Kathy Collins. Now, usually, when Lance saw this photograph, he would smile, but today, he flipped it face down so he wouldn't have to look at it. He was going to have to break up with Kathy, and he was not looking forward to it. Lance and Kathy had been on again, off again since they first met 3 years ago. But they'd rekindled things for real about 7 months ago, and she had moved most of her stuff into his house. But for Lance, this progression sort of made the whole thing feel too serious. He sort of preferred to play the field. In fact, at that very moment, he didn't just have this one girlfriend. He had another steady girlfriend, a 27-year-old college student named Dion Baugh, and he was also interested in another woman that he had just met who worked as a school teacher. Plus, he was also still dealing with the fallout from his divorce from his 3rd wife, Janine Herndon, who he had a 4-year-old son with. Lance actually had to keep meticulous notes in his calendar just to keep all of this straight, and it was really starting to wear on him. Plus, in addition to dumping Kathy, something he knew he needed to do soon, he was also considering dumping Dion as well, because she was the jealous type and he just felt like he didn't need the drama. But for now, Lance threw on a shirt and a pair of pants and then headed downstairs into his basement, where he had a full working office set up for his IT company. Every day, Lance's small staff of full-time employees, plus his assistant, came to this basement office to do all their work. But they wouldn't actually arrive here for another 4 hours, which gave Lance plenty of time to get everything ready. Lance sat down at his desk, hit the record button on a small tape recorder, and started dictating detailed lists of instructions for each of his employees. Every morning, he would make these cassette tapes so that when his employees came in, they knew exactly what he wanted them to do, even if he had already gone out for the day, which he was doing more and more lately. When Lance had first started Access Inc., he had pretty much worked exclusively on his business all the time and was never really out of the office. But recently, business had not been going very well, and so Lance's attention was now split between, a growing list of problems and new ventures he was considering. He hadn't told anybody the details, but Access Inc. was in pretty big financial trouble. At its peak, it had been valued at more than $3 million, but now the business was heavily in debt and losing money. Lance had tried to diversify by investing in a hip-hop club in downtown Atlanta, but that had failed, and now he was embroiled in a lawsuit with his former business partner. Add all that to the alimony and child support that Lance was paying to his ex-wife, plus the lavish lifestyles he was funding for his various girlfriends, and for the first time in his life, Lance was starting to worry about whether he could even hold everything together. Lance finished the cassette tapes for his employees and left them on their desks. Then he went back upstairs to get ready for his day. By the time his workers actually started arriving at 8 a.m. through the designated office side door, Lance was already halfway through his list of daily tasks in his calendar. Which meant, by the time the late afternoon rolled around, Lance was free to leave his house, and therefore his office, and go to his mother's house to have dinner. His grandmother, who was visiting from out of town, was going to be at this dinner, along with Lance's ex-wife and their son. But despite wanting to see his family, Lance didn't stay for very long. At around 8 p.m., he told his mother, his grandmother, his ex-wife, and his son that he had to get back to work. Then he said goodbye and drove the 5 minutes back to his house. When Lance pulled back into his driveway, he saw his secretary's light blue car parked in its usual spot, and he smiled. His secretary was a woman named Talana Caraway, and she was one of his closest friends. They had been romantic in the past, In fact, Lance's divorce was caused in part by the fact that his wife had found racy pictures he had of Talana. But now, their relationship was purely platonic, and they both actually confided in each other about their respective love lives. Talana worked another full-time job, so she typically only worked evenings for Lance. Lance went in the office door and found Talana working her way through the list of tasks that he had outlined for her on her cassette tape. Talana was very obviously happy to see him, and for a little while, the two of them just sat there chatting and catching up. Talana was apparently having trouble with her partner, a guy named Jazz, and she complained about him a bit. Lance actually knew Jazz because he had lent him some money, and he nodded sympathetically. Lance told Talana that he was actually hoping for a fresh start in the romance department, because he had another new woman, but this one he was really interested in. He said she was a teacher and she was really nice, and he asked Talana if she would help him write her a card. And like he knew she would, Talana just laughed. Like, the idea that the ex-girlfriend is now writing a card for the new girlfriend was just kind of comical to her. But this was actually one of the things that Lance really liked best about Talana, and it's why their relationship continued to flourish. She was just easygoing, unlike his various current girlfriends. And so Talana, without any hesitation, helped write the card, and then Lance signed it. As Lance stood up to head upstairs, Talana gestured for him to wait. Then she handed him a couple slips of paper. She said they were messages from his girlfriend Dion, who had called for him a couple of times while he was out. At this, Lance groaned. Dion was a lot to deal with. A month earlier, she'd shown up at his house unannounced while Kathy was over. Dion had seen Kathy through the window, and she had made such a scene that Lance actually had to call the police. She actually had a court hearing about that incident tomorrow that Lance was supposed to go to. Lance thanked Talana for the messages, and then he went upstairs to his bedroom to begin moving Kathy's things out of his closet. About 2.5 hours later, at around 10:30 p.m., Talana came upstairs and told Lance she'd see him tomorrow. It was raining, so Lance made her promise to call him when she got home so he knew she was safe. And she would do that around 11:30 p.m., and they actually chatted for another few minutes on the phone. But at some point, Lance told Talana goodnight. He could have talked to her for hours, but he knew that he didn't have long before his morning alarms would start going off. The next morning, August 8th, at exactly 8 a.m., one of Lance's employees arrived at his house and unlocked the side office door. And the first thing she noticed when she stepped inside was that Lance was not there. This was weird because even on days where Lance left early, he was usually at his desk first thing in the morning. But the employee figured that maybe Lance had an appointment. So she went over to his calendar to check to see where he was, but, sort of atypical for him, there was nothing listed for that day. That was when she noticed the second thing, which was that Lance had not left her a cassette tape for the day. And this was not just weird, it was completely unprecedented. Lance had literally never not left her a tape. And so the employee paged Lance, but he didn't answer. So, unsure what else to do, the employee just sat down and started to work. About an hour later, at 9 a.m., another employee arrived, but there was still no sign of Lance. The two employees paged him a few more times, but he still didn't answer. And even though both of them considered going upstairs and just checking on him, neither of them felt comfortable doing that. After all, the upstairs was Lance's house. It just felt like an invasion of privacy. Finally, at 10 a.m., so 2 hours after that first employee arrived, Lance's mother, who also worked at Access Inc., arrived at her son's house. She had come in through the garage, and when she entered the office and the employees told her that Lance was still not there, she said that didn't make any sense because his car was in the garage. So, the two employees waited in the office while Lance's mother went up to search the house. And for a few minutes, the two employees down in the basement heard nothing. The house was quiet. They could just hear the sound of Lance's mother walking around upstairs. But then, out of nowhere, they heard a scream. About 30 minutes later, around 10:30 a.m., Roswell police detective William Anastasio pulled up in front of a mansion that sat on a quiet cul-de-sac in a wealthy community in suburban Georgia. The only thing dispatch had told him was that someone inside of this mansion had been killed. Outside of the mansion, he could see there were police cruisers and ambulances on the street, and his sergeant and a few other investigators were standing in a cluster right near the front door. He walked over to them, and the sergeant briefed him on what they knew so far. The homeowner, Lance Herndon, had been found dead inside of his bed by his own mother after he had failed to show up for work in his basement office. There were no signs of forced entry, and the crime scene itself appeared to be contained to the master bedroom. Lance's employees had discovered that the office laptop was missing, but the rest of the house was filled with expensive electronics and jewelry that had not been touched. The sergeant told Anastasio that uniformed officers were already canvassing the neighborhood and that Anastasio should take the lead in the investigation. So Anastasio turned and walked inside the house and began going up the stairs to the master bedroom. Outside the door to the bedroom, there was a uniformed officer whose job was to make sure nobody touched anything before the crime scene techs arrived. And so Anastasio greeted him and told him he understood the protocol, but then he just stood there outside the doorway, not interfering, but looking inside, getting a first glimpse of the actual crime scene. He could see Lance's body on the bed. Lance was on his back, with his arms crossed over his chest, and he was naked. Even from a distance, Anastasio could see that whoever had killed Lance had beaten him so badly in the face that his facial bones had basically collapsed inwards. It was like someone truly bashed his head in. But strangely, despite this, it didn't seem like there had been any sort of struggle in this room. I mean, typically with a beating death, there was often a big fight between the victim and the assailant, which can create a very messy scene with furniture knocked over and everything messed around inside the room. But from the looks of it, it didn't seem like Lance had fought back at all. Like nothing was knocked over. He was just laying there on his back on the bed with his head caved in. And reinforcing the idea that this was not about money, Anastasio could clearly see on the dresser next to the body was a wallet, a stack of credit cards, and a folded up wad of cash. And so despite the one missing laptop, this didn't really appear to be a robbery. And so as Anastasio went back down the stairs towards the office he had been told was located in the basement, he was thinking to himself that Lance must have known his killer. This had to have been personal. In the basement office, Anastasio found a police officer standing with a small cluster of very shocked-looking women. One was Lance's grandmother, another was Lance's mother, and the other two were employees of Lance's company. Anastasio spoke with each of them one by one. And Lance's family, their general impression was they had no idea who would want to hurt Lance. Lance's mother told Anastasio that, Lance had just gone through a divorce, which could create some animosity, but he and his ex-wife had stayed on good terms. And in fact, just the night before, had had dinner together. Lance's grandmother echoed a similar sentiment that, Lance was this harmless guy, but she also had Alzheimer's and so couldn't really answer any of the questions, at least not credibly. The other two women, the employees of Lance's company, they told a slightly different story to Anastasio. They said there had been some, quote, shady people in the office recently, but when he pressed them for specifics, they said all they knew was that Lance was involved in some business disputes. Just then, a uniformed officer opened the basement door and told Anastasio he'd better get outside. The detective jogged outside, and there, at the foot of the long driveway, he saw a woman sitting in a car. The uniformed officer told him that was Lance's ex-wife, Janine. This was not what Anastasio had expected, and he would have preferred to talk to the ex-wife under more controlled circumstances, not suddenly at the crime scene. But it was also an opportunity, because it was very likely that Anastasio would be the first person to tell her that Lance was dead. And in a murder case, the ex-spouse is always a suspect, and so Anastasio wanted to see how Janine reacted to the news of her ex-husband's murder. So he walked down to her car, and as he did, Janine got out of the car looking panicked, and she told him that someone in the house had paged her. She asked what was going on, but Anastasio, without saying anything, just gestured for her to come with him to his cruiser. Once they were seated inside, he broke the news. And as he did, he carefully watched her. And Janine looked genuinely shocked. She opened and then closed her mouth like she couldn't even think of what to say, and then her eyes filled with tears. And then, in a trembling voice, she asked Anastasio what happened. But Anastasio was not ready to share anything at this point. So instead, he just asked Janine where she had been last night, and then waited to see if she got defensive or started stuttering. But she didn't do either of those things. She took a deep breath, and then told him she had actually had dinner with Lance and his family the night before, and then after that, she went home. Her new partner had come over and spent the night with her, and then that morning, she'd gotten up at 7 a.m. to head to her side job as a house cleaner, and then of course at about 10:30 she'd received that page, and here she was. And that detail, that the ex-wife of an obviously very wealthy man was working as a cleaner, caught Anastasio's attention. He wondered if she'd still be working as a cleaner after she received whatever life insurance payout he was certain was going to come her way. But before he could ask her anything about her finances or her job, Janine blurted something out. She said, "My husband was a powerful man with a lot of enemies." By the time Detective Anastasio finished his conversation with Janine, he had gone from having 0 suspects to having 6. There was Janine herself, of course, but Anastasio had been surprised to learn that Lance had been seriously dating at least 2 other women, Kathy Collins and Dion Baugh, and that his secretary, Talana Caraway, was also a former girlfriend. This meant that Janine, Kathy, Dion, and Talana all had potential motives to want Lance dead. But Janine had actually been much more focused on the men who hated Lance. She said that Lance had always talked about business rivals being jealous of his success. And recently, he'd become embroiled in at least 2 lawsuits that Janine knew of, one with a former business partner over a hip-hop club, and the other with a contractor who said he hadn't been paid yet. Janine had heard that just yesterday, that contractor had actually shown up to a local music show looking for Lance. And when he couldn't find him, apparently he was telling people that, Lance didn't know what he was capable of, as if the contractor could, inflict harm on Lance if he didn't pay him. Anastasio was not quite sure what to think about any of this, except that he was definitely going to need a lot of DNA samples. That afternoon, Anastasio was back inside of the house, working alongside the crime scene techs who had finally arrived at about noon. And while he was doing that, 2 other women showed up at the crime scene. One of the women was Lance's secretary and former girlfriend, Talana Calloway. She said she had seen Lance the night before, and that one of his girlfriends, Dion, had kept calling for him over and over and kept leaving increasingly upset messages when he didn't answer. And these messages, Talana was fielding, and she gave them to Lance when he finally did come home. The other woman who was there with Talana was Lance's other girlfriend, Kathy Collins. But unlike Janine and Talana, Kathy didn't even try to act like she wanted to help with this investigation. Instead, she demanded to be let inside the house to go get her clothes. The uniformed officers on the scene told her that she couldn't do that because this was a crime scene, but Kathy didn't seem to care at all. And so the officers took down her name and contact info, and they also made a note that Kathy had not shed a single tear. Early the next morning, Detective Anastasio went to the medical examiner's office to observe the autopsy. He'd been at the crime scene until late, and once the crime scene techs processed everything, he'd gotten a closer look at the physical evidence, and a couple things had stood out to him. First, Lance had 3 alarm clocks, and all of them had been unplugged. And one of the alarm clocks was an analog clock, and when it was unplugged, it stopped at whatever time it was, which in this case was 4:10 a.m. And so, it was theoretically possible that perhaps the clocks began going off while the killer was still inside the house, and so they rushed over and unplugged the clocks to stop the alarm, which then put the likely time of death at or sometime before 4:10 in the morning on August 8th. Second, on the dresser, there was a framed photograph of a woman in lingerie that had been turned face down. The picture appeared to be deliberately flipped, not knocked over, as if whoever had flipped it didn't want to look at this picture. And third, inside of Lance's bed sheets were several pieces of long hair that clearly belonged to more than one woman, and there were also some short hairs as well. Now, Anastasio and the medical examiner both looked down at Lance's body. He'd apparently been hit at least 7 times in the face, with something long, heavy, and curved at the end. The medical examiner had seen wounds like this once before and thought the murder weapon could be a wrench. However, there was not a single defensive wound on Lance. He clearly had not raised his hands to stop any of the blows that his killer had rained down on him. That, combined with the fact that he'd been found naked in bed with no signs of struggle around him, suggested to Anastasio that the attack had begun when Lance was asleep. The medical examiner said that, judging from the locations of the blows and the blood spatter that he'd seen at the crime scene, the killer had likely climbed on top of Lance before they beat him to death. And this was very significant to Anastasio. On his list of suspects, he had female romantic partners and male business rivals. But whoever had killed Lance had not had to break into the house because Lance had clearly let them in, and also Lance felt comfortable enough with them to go to sleep naked near them. Then, to commit the murder, the killer had straddled Lance's chest, which was a very intimate position. And so to Anastasio, these details all combined suggested that his killer was a woman. When Detective Anastasio got back to the station, he claimed the single interview room inside the Roswell Police headquarters and began doing interviews. He had a forensics person standing by to get hair samples and fingerprints from all his subjects to match against the crime scene. Anastasio spoke again to Lance's mother, also his ex-wife Janine, and those 2 employees who had been at the house when the body was found, and he took all their DNA. Anastasio didn't really suspect the mother or the employees, but he did have a feeling about Janine. Janine was cooperating, but she would stay on his list until he could definitively nail down her alibi and take a look at her financials. Next up was Kathy Collins, one of Lance's girlfriends who had shown up at the crime scene totally distraught about her clothing. And the moment she sat down in the chair in the interview room, Anastasio recognized her as the woman in that downturned photograph on Lance's dresser. And when Anastasio began asking questions, he sort of half expected her to again ask about her clothes. But instead, Kathy laid out what Anastasio had to admit was a pretty good alibi. Kathy said she had been out of town at a family funeral and had arrived back in Roswell on August 7th in the evening along with her niece. She and her niece had gotten dinner at a restaurant close to Lance's house and had stayed there until about maybe 10:30 or 11 p.m. She then gave Anastasio a receipt from a gas station that was in another state, along with the tab from the restaurant to back these details up. Although Anastasio noted that she and her niece had only eaten $7 worth of food, which seemed very light for how long they had been there. However, Anastasio knew that, Lance was not killed while Kathy and her niece were allegedly at this restaurant on August 7th. Instead, he was very likely killed in the early morning hours of August 8th, likely around 4:10 a.m. But Kathy said, she had spent the entire night on August 7th into August 8th with her other romantic partner. She said that she and Lance had never really been all that monogamous. In fact, when they met, both of them were married. So when Anastasio asked Kathy if it was possible that Lance might have been thinking about breaking up with her, she just shrugged and said they really weren't that close anymore. She told Anastasio she'd be happy to provide DNA samples and fingerprints because she didn't kill him. Before she got up to leave, Kathy told Anastasio there was one more thing. She said about a month earlier, some woman had come to Lance's home in the middle of the night, freaking out so loudly that Lance had actually called the police. If the police were thinking one of Lance's girlfriends killed him, Kathy said they should start by finding that woman. When the door closed behind Kathy, Anastasio smiled. Because a record search had already turned up the police report for the incident Kathy was talking about. And that woman, the girlfriend, was Dion Baugh, who was already on her way down to the station. When Dion arrived, she took a seat inside the interview room, and right away, Anastasio began drilling her with questions. And immediately, he was suspicious. First of all, Dion's demeanor was very strange. She kept giggling every time she was asked a question. Now, Anastasio knew that likely she was just nervous, and so that by itself was not proof of guilt, but it certainly didn't help her credibility. Second, Dion herself was carrying on multiple romantic relationships, just like Lance. And third, perhaps the most suspicious out of all of it, Dion admitted right up front that she had Lance's missing laptop, as well as one of his credit cards. And in fact, she had charged $2,700 worth of furniture on it the same night that Lance was murdered. Suddenly, Dion Baugh was Anastasio's number one suspect. And so the detective leaned forward in his chair and asked Dion where she'd been from the evening of August 7th to the morning of August 8th. And her alibi was very weak. She said she had been at home, without her husband or her daughter, who were visiting family. In fact, Dion said there was no one who could confirm this for her. But Dion insisted that she hadn't murdered Lance, She said that Lance did a lot of good stuff for her. He had bought her a beautiful Mercedes car, and he gave her hundreds of dollars in cash every week, plus the use of his credit cards. And then she asked the detective, why would she be so stupid as to make a giant purchase with one of those credit cards on the same night that he was killed? It would be so suspicious. She also said he lent her his laptop all the time for school, and any of his employees could confirm that. Dion said that on August 7th, she had called Lance repeatedly, but he never answered. And then on August 8th, the day his body was found, he was supposed to go with her to court to help her clear the charge she had picked up on the night a month earlier when he had called the cops on her for coming to his home acting crazy. But he hadn't shown up in court. She said she'd been so angry and called him repeatedly throughout the day to see why he blew her off, but he never answered on the 8th. Of course, she said now she knew why. It was because he was dead. Dion offered Anastasio her phone records. She said she would give DNA samples and her fingerprints. And then she told him she really hoped he solved the case soon because she was afraid. She said that Lance was always paying people to do his dirty work, and until detectives caught his killer, she was going to be looking over her shoulder, in case maybe they came for her too. Anastasio would spend the next couple of weeks trying to run down the alibis of every single person and their significant others who might have wanted Lance Herndon dead. It was a long list. Some people the detective did feel ready to rule out. Lance's ex-wife, Janine Herndon, for example, had a solid alibi confirmed by her new partner. And although she would have been the recipient, along with her son, of Lance's life insurance policy, she was already receiving a good amount of money from Lance monthly in the form of alimony and child support. And so Lance was worth more to her alive than dead. And then there were Lance's various business rivals, and they turned out to be very weak suspects, primarily because they all had alibis. Plus, it just seemed very unlikely that Lance would have, let these business rivals into his home late at night without some sort of confrontation. But as the investigation wore on, other suspects who Anastasio had also been ready to write off started behaving in ways that made them look more suspicious, not less. Kathy Collins, for example, who was really bent out of shape about not getting her clothes back, had supplied a more or less rock-solid alibi, plus DNA and fingerprints. But 6 days after the murder, she had sent a demand letter to the police station listing off every item she had left inside of Lance's home, down to her sunglasses, perfume, and a bottle of wine, asking for all of it back immediately. It was an outrageously cold move from somebody who should have been at least a little sad about Lance's death. And then there was Talana Caraway, the girlfriend turned secretary/platonic friend. On the day Lance's body was found, she had come to Lance's home because she said she wanted to help. That action could be viewed either as proof that she had nothing to hide, or as inserting herself into the investigation and offering distractions from her own guilt. And after that first day, when she'd been so willing to talk and cooperate, now she had clammed up. Another detective on Anastasio's team had gone to her house to ask some follow-up questions, and she had refused to come to the door at all. Then she'd shown up at the police station with her own lawyer. And that wasn't all. The only thing police had learned during their canvass of the neighborhood on the first day of the investigation was that apparently somebody had been spotted driving through the neighborhood in a light blue car at about 4:40 a.m. This timeline matched up with the ballpark time of death of 4:10 a.m., and the vehicle description matched Talana's own car. However, apparently people thought they saw a man driving that car at 4:40 a.m. And so after learning this, Anastasio did some digging, and he discovered that Talana's partner, Jazz, owed Lance money, and that Jazz had a criminal record. And so while Anastasio doubted that Jazz could have on his own just walked his way into Lance's house, he did think it was quite possible that Talana could get inside and then maybe open the door for Jazz. Finally, there was Dion Baugh, the woman who had shown up at Lance's house and acted crazy and had police called on her. Of all of Lance's girlfriends, her alibi was absolutely the weakest, and her level of anger and outrage at Lance was definitely the highest. Also, she literally had Lance's missing computer and one of his credit cards. But as the days ticked by, Anastasia was realizing that none of the details surrounding Dion were smoking guns. Dion's phone records confirmed her story about making repeated calls to Lance, and Lance's other employees confirmed that Dion did sometimes borrow his laptop. That was normal. And Lance's banking information showed that throughout his entire relationship with Dion, he spent tons of money on her. And so the idea that she would buy, $2,700 of furniture on the night of his murder looked suspicious, but actually appeared to be pretty typical. Dion had willingly given DNA and fingerprints, and the police had matched 3 of the hairs found in Lance's bed to Dion, but they'd also found 13 other hairs that didn't belong to Dion, Lance, or any of the other women they knew Lance had slept with. And since Dion had already admitted to sleeping with Lance in his bed not long before the murder, the hairs really weren't proof of anything Anastasio didn't already know. Detective Anastasio still didn't have the murder weapon either. Now, the medical examiner had guessed that Lance was killed with a wrench, and after interviewing Lance's housekeeper, police had discovered that a wrench was missing from Lance's home. But a missing murder weapon couldn't give any fingerprints. And so far, none of the women that Anastasio had collected prints from had matched prints found in Lance's bedroom. And so within about a month of Lance's murder, the case that had seemed so hot on that first day was now going cold. More than a year would pass, and in that time, Detective Anastasio would continue to investigate Lance Herndon's murder, but he really didn't make any progress. He stayed in touch with the prosecutor, with both of them hoping that some new lead would turn up, but all their evidence had gotten them nowhere. And so between business rivals, romantic partners, and romantic partners' significant others, it felt like this murder could have plausibly been committed by at least 10 different people. That was until January of 1998, when the prosecutor who had been working with Anastasio got a phone call. And on this call, the caller told them that Lance's killer was currently involved in a heated divorce case. And during arguments for that case, the killer had destroyed their own alibi for the night of Lance's murder. Now, it had been 17 months at this point since Lance had been killed, but the prosecutor was still skeptical that the killer would really be so sloppy as to present evidence to a different court that went against what they'd already told local police. But then, later that month, the prosecutor went to the divorce trial to watch for himself, and there, everything came together. Based on evidence and interviews conducted during an investigation that spanned a year and a half, this is what police believe happened to Lance Herndon in the early morning hours of August 8, 1996. The killer lay in bed next to Lance, listening to him breathe. And as they did, a feeling of rage grew in the killer's chest. Lance was just lying there, peacefully sleeping, with no care in the world for how badly he was hurting the killer. Lance didn't know that the killer knew he had lied to them. Lance had fallen asleep thinking that he had the killer fooled, but Lance was wrong, and the killer couldn't stand it any longer. And so they slipped out of bed and headed downstairs, where they retrieved the wrench they had seen on a countertop earlier. Then, with the weapon in hand, they went back into the master bedroom, got back in bed, and climbed right on top of Lance, straddling him. Then, while Lance slept peacefully right in front of them, the killer raised the wrench up and then brought it down on his face so hard that Lance was instantly knocked unconscious. And so Lance did nothing as the killer repeatedly smashed the wrench into Lance's face over and over again until his skull literally caved in and Lance was dead. After the frenzy, the killer climbed off of Lance and cleaned themselves up. Lance's alarm clocks began going off, and the killer panicked and just unplugged them all. Then they put back on their clothes and hurried downstairs. But the killer did not leave right away. Instead, they first went down to Lance's home office and made sure to take his laptop computer with them, something they had checked before they decided to kill him. Because the killer was Dion Baugh, one of Lance's many girlfriends. And one thing inside of that laptop helped explain her motive. It was Lance's daily calendar, which he had always updated so meticulously to keep his appointments and his girlfriends straight. But officials said Dion killed Lance in part because of the one thing he had not put into his calendar, which was her court appearance, scheduled for the morning of August 8th. Lance had promised to go to court with her on that day to help her clear the charge she'd picked up for coming to his home in the middle of the night a month earlier. But Lance's calendar for August 8th was completely empty. Lance had no intention of going, and Dion knew it. To Dion, this was an unforgivable betrayal, and so she bludgeoned Lance to death. Dion ultimately incriminated herself during her divorce trial by telling the court she had actually gone to Lance's house on August 7th, hours before he was killed. Remember, she had told police at the time that she had not done that and she was home alone the whole time, was never at his house. And so when the prosecutor who sat in on the divorce trial actually heard her testimony, which directly contradicted her alibi that she had given, he had her arrested as soon as she left the courthouse. Ultimately, Dion pleaded guilty to manslaughter and was sentenced to 10 years in prison. She was released in 2011. In the late summer of 1930, Raphael Pansardi and his wife Leonarda Cianciulli moved with their 4 young kids to a little town in northern Italy called Correggio. A terrible earthquake had destroyed the family's previous village and killed nearly all of their neighbors. And so this family was feeling very lucky to be alive, but when they arrived in Correggio, they really had nothing and were hoping that, the people of this town will just be very welcoming and generous and kind of help them get set up again. And the people of this town did exactly that. Correggio was this beautiful place inside of a fertile valley where people lived in these cottages surrounded by rice fields and mulberry trees. And the people who lived there were very tight-knit and looked after each other and cooked for each other and had parties together. This was a real community. And so when Raphael and Leonarda arrived, the townspeople immediately found them this cute little cottage by a stream with a whitewashed front door and a beautiful stone hearth for cooking, and there was an attached storefront on this cottage that they were giving them. And then on top of that, once the family had moved in, the family's new neighbors helped get Raphael a job, and they also helped Leonarda set up the attached storefront that was part of their cottage so she could sell her homemade soap bars out of this shop. And so very quickly, the family just completely fell in love with Correggio, especially 36-year-old Leonarda. Losing her home and her previous neighbors in that terrible earthquake had been a tragedy on epic scale, but it was far from the first tragedy that Leonarda had been forced to live through. Leonarda had been born into poverty. Her mother had actually come from a very wealthy family, but they had cut Leonarda's mom off when she became pregnant with Leonarda. And so when Leonarda's mom gave birth to her, she blamed Leonarda for their poverty and all of their problems, and so beat her relentlessly. And then on top of that, Leonarda's father died when she was very young, and so she was stuck at home being abused constantly by her mother. When Leonarda was 21, she met Raphael and fell in love with him, and he was a very kind and gentle man. He really made a very strong first impression on anyone who met him. But when Leonarda went to her mother and introduced Raphael to her and said, "I'm going to marry this man, I love him," her mother flew into a rage and then literally cursed Leonarda. She actually out loud muttered this spell and then told Leonarda that because of the spell, Leonarda would have evil following her forever. Now, of course, Leonarda was very used to her mother's terrible behavior, and so she did not actually think she was at risk of this curse affecting her life in any way. But not long after actually marrying Raphael, Leonarda began to see evidence that this curse might actually be real. It started with Leonarda having these sudden fits of seizures for no particular reason, and then Leonarda, every time she got pregnant, she would miscarry and lose the baby. And so feeling really sad and desperate because all she wanted was a family, Leonarda actually went to a fortune teller in hopes that they would tell her that in the future, her life got better, not worse, which to Leonarda meant, the curse was not real if my life improves. But after this fortune teller took Leonarda's hands and studied her palms, she looked up at Leonarda and gave her grave news. She said, "Leonarda, you're going to have living children, but they're all going to die young. And I see a prison and an insane asylum in your future." This experience totally shocked Leonarda and confirmed for her that her mother's curse must be real. And sure enough, over the following years, Leonarda and Raphael would go on to have 14 living children, and 10 of them would die when they were babies or toddlers. And so by the time Leonarda had arrived in Correggio with her family in 1930, she was absolutely petrified that her last 4 precious children would die because of this curse. And so in order to keep her kids safe, she basically never let them out of her sight, and then she also made sure they always adhered to these strange rules and beliefs that Leonarda had come up with about good and evil that were designed to somehow protect the kids from this curse. But the incredible show of generosity and support and kindness that Leonarda and her family had experienced when they arrived in Correggio had really done something to Leonarda. In fact, it really kind of changed the way she viewed the world. Suddenly, she was less concerned with this curse and how to protect her family from it, and instead, she was just kind of content. She felt safe. She felt happy. The women in the town loved Leonarda and always came by the house to say hi to her and eat some of the amazing tea cakes that she would make. And also, Leonarda had become best friends with this woman named Virginia, who was a former opera singer from Milan, who was very elegant and beautiful. And every time she went to a dinner party, she would invite Leonarda. And also, Leonarda and her family were becoming financially stable really for the first time ever. Leonarda's soap shop that she ran out of their cottage was really successful. People came from all around to buy her soaps because nobody could make them like she could. And Raphael's job as a clerk was very steady, and he too was becoming well respected in town. And so because of how well this transition to Correggio had been, at some point Leonarda made a promise both to herself and to the universe that instead of focusing all of her time and energy on this curse, which had plagued her whole life, instead she was going to focus on helping the people of Correggio any way she could because they had done so much for her. And that is exactly what Leonarda did, but in a kind of ironic way. Because of the fear Leonarda had for her mother's curse, she had gone to that fortune teller many years ago. And even though the news she got when she saw the fortune teller was horrible, Leonarda had left that experience kind of fascinated with the art of fortune telling and magic and sorcery. It just really appealed to her. And so now that Leonarda was running this very successful soap shop out of her house, there were all these people coming from far and wide that would ask to barter for her soaps. Bartering is like trading one item for another item versus paying for something outright with money. And so Leonarda began bartering with these travelers whenever they had books about fortune telling, about magic, about sorcery, about how to make potions, about the occult. And after reading through all of these books and learning as much as she could, Leonarda, in addition to selling her soaps, began offering fortune telling services to the people of Correggio. And it would turn out she was really good at predicting the future, to the point where people in town basically began going to her for all kinds of advice. She helped women find love, she told farmers what crops to plant, she created these charm bags for people and told them they would protect them. She also began creating these herb potions for people when they got sick. It actually got to the point where people trusted her so much that when they got sick, they didn't even go to the doctor, they just went to her. And so very quickly, Leonarda felt very proud of the fact that she had lived up to the promise she had made both to herself and to the universe to always help the people of Correggio at every turn. But more than that, Leonarda was starting to think that this newfound sense of purpose and happiness she was getting in helping the people of Correggio through her various services had finally broken her mother's curse. By 1939, Leonarda and her family had been living in Correggio very happily for almost 10 years, and at the time, Leonarda's oldest son, Giuseppe, was 17 years old. Giuseppe was tall, he was handsome, he had dark hair, he had dark eyes, and all the girls loved him. And Giuseppe and Leonarda had always had a very close relationship. Every day, Giuseppe would come home, and he and his mom would sit in the kitchen, and they would chat for a while and eat some of her tea cakes. But now, in 1939, when Giuseppe was 17, he started to act a little bit different. He would come home, and instead of going into the kitchen to sit with Leonarda, he would just go straight to his room and shut the door. And when Leonardo or Raphael would ask him, hey, is everything okay? Giuseppe would get very defensive and say he was fine and to please just leave me alone. But to Leonardo, it seemed really obvious that her son was not fine, and she thought, maybe he has some sort of secret he's keeping, and that's what's making him act this way. He's hurting on the inside, but he can't share it with the world. But Leonardo had no idea what this secret might be. And then one day, late that same year, Leonardo was walking through town when one of her neighbors came up to her and said, "Hey, are you aware that your son Giuseppe has signed up for the military and he's leaving for training in just a few months?" Leonardo had not heard about this. People were talking a lot about World War II, which had just started around this time, but Leonardo had never considered that her precious son would go off to fight in that war. But now, Leonardo realized that Giuseppe's recent strange behavior suddenly made sense. This was the secret he was keeping. He had joined the military, and he hadn't told his family. Leonardo turned around and went straight home. She went right into her bedroom, shut the door, and she just sobbed. To her, it felt like her mother's curse was back, and now her precious son was going to go off into the war, and he was going to die. Unless she found a way to combat this evil that was now following her again. So, for the next several days, Leonardo did not open up her soap shop, she didn't come downstairs, she just stayed locked in her bedroom and read through all of her books about magic and sorcery and the occult, looking for some sort of solution for how to fight this curse. And finally, she figured out what she had to do. She read that if she gave something beautiful to the universe would reward her. And in Leonardo's mind, that reward would be sparing her son. And so Leonardo decided that the most beautiful thing she could offer the universe would be to help the people of Correggio, which she was already doing, but in her mind, she thought she could really ramp up her efforts and really try to change people's lives. And she thought if she could do that, the universe was sure to notice and it would save her son's life. Leonardo decided that the first person she would really go above and beyond to help inside of Correggio was a woman named Faustina. Faustina, who was in her 70s, was desperate to get married, but to many people in town, including Leonardo, she seemed kind of beyond help. She was totally antisocial, she was awkward, and just kind of given her age, it seemed like marriage was just not in the cards for her. But this is where Leonardo thought she could step in and change everything for Faustina. She would find her a husband. So Leonardo reached out to Faustina and told her about a friend of hers, a man, who lived in a city to the north, who was also alone in his old age and who was likely looking for marriage, and she could set them up if Faustina was interested. And so Faustina was immediately interested and wanted to meet this guy, but Leonardo did tell her that, this guy, the reason he's not married is he's kind of difficult to be around, he's kind of a jerk, but he's got a wonderful heart, he means well, I think he'd be a great fit for you. And so again, Faustina's like, great, I want to meet him, I want to marry him, I'm ready. And then finally, the day came when Faustina actually went to this other town and met this guy in person, and they fell in love. And Faustina just moved right in with him, and before long, she was sending happy postcards back to Correggio, telling everyone about how happy she was and how thankful she was for Leonardo's help in setting them up. And so Leonardo was obviously thrilled not only for her friend's happiness, but also it really felt like she had checked the box in terms of really going above and beyond to help someone in Correggio in an effort to get the universe to spare her son. But her son was still a couple months away from leaving for training, and Leonardo, she's very superstitious, and she's thinking, okay, I don't know if that was enough to get the universe to save my son. And so I need to find somebody else I can help. So in September of 1940, Leonardo began her next good deed project with another woman in town. She was a widow in her 50s named Francesca. She had worked as a teacher, but when her husband got sick, she quit her job, and then when her husband ultimately died, she was left with nothing. So Leonardo reached out to Francesca
and told her that she, Leonarda, would be willing to reach out to her own mother's rich family to see if maybe they had a job they could finesse for Francesca. Now, of course, Leonarda was not excited about talking to her mother's family, who had disowned her mother and had shown no interest in Leonarda. But Leonarda wanted to do this for Francesca and for the sake of her son and getting the universe to notice what she was doing. And so sure enough, Leonarda would reach out to her mother's family, and they were remarkably open to the idea, and they got a job for Francesca in Switzerland. And so eventually, Francesca jetted off to Switzerland, and then a couple of days later, she was sending postcards back to Correggio saying how happy she was and how thankful she was for Leonarda's help. And so again, Leonarda was so happy about this outcome, both because she cared about Francesca and also because this was yet another kind of check in the box of her good deeds that the universe was going to notice that in turn would save her son. But again, after Francesca didn't need any more help, Leonarda found herself looking at her son, who was getting closer and closer to leaving for training, and she would think to herself, have I done enough to protect him? Have I really stopped this curse from killing him after he leaves? And Leonarda eventually decided that no, she had not done enough. She needed to do at least one more really big good deed for someone in this town. And who better to help than her best friend, Virginia, the former opera singer? Leonarda knew from all her talks with Virginia that Virginia really missed living in the big city and going to the opera house. And so Leonarda reached out to Virginia and said, you know what? I can reach out to my mother's rich family and maybe they can find a job for you in a big city if you're interested. And so Virginia was like, wow, yes, I would love that. That's an amazing opportunity. And so Leonarda again would contact her mother's rich family, and again they came through, finding this job as a social planner for this very rich guy in Florence, Italy, who often funded plays and operas. And so this job was perfect for Virginia. When Leonarda told Virginia about this opportunity, Virginia cried tears of joy. After packing up all of her things, Virginia made a stop at Leonarda's house to say goodbye and thank you, and the two women would hug and laugh and cry, they would drink wine together, and then finally, when it was time for Virginia to go, even though Leonarda was very sad, she was also quite happy, because finally she felt like this good deed was enough to get the universe to spare her son. However, Leonarda, being a very superstitious person, did have one more little thing she wanted to do with Giuseppe before he left for the military. And this little thing was her, Leonarda, bathing her son, her 18-year-old son, with a particular bar of soap, and then she also wanted to feed him a special kind of tea cake that she was going to make. The soap and the tea cake had these special herbs and ingredients and different things she had pulled from her books of magic and the occult, and they would kind of form like a protective barrier both outside and inside of Giuseppe. So, on the same night that Virginia headed off to Florence, when Giuseppe came home, Leonarda approached him and said, I want to give you this bath and I want to feed you these tea cakes. And Giuseppe was not remotely enthused at the idea of having his mom bathe him. He's 18. But he knew she was highly superstitious. She seemed pretty emotional about this, and it just seemed like it was extremely important to her. And so he said, okay. And so Leonarda washed her son with this special kind of magic soap, and then she also gave him the tea cakes. And then afterward, even though Giuseppe was really annoyed by what he had just been asked to do, Leonarda was so happy she was practically floating. She felt like she had done everything she could possibly do, and now she could just relax because her son was safe. But soon, Leonarda would learn that that was not actually true. A few days after giving her son the magical last bath and magical tea cakes, the police showed up at the front door of Leonarda's house. And when she opened the door and saw the police, she asked what was going on, and the police would say to her, hey, the 3 women that you supposedly helped that left town recently, they've all been reported missing by their families. They don't know where they are. And so Leonarda, she was totally shocked by this, and she said, no, that's not possible. I write to them all the time. I get postcards that come in very regularly from all of them. And then Leonardo went and got the postcards and showed the police, like, look, I'm talking to them. How could they possibly be missing? And so the police, they would look at these letters and they would agree with Leonardo that it is pretty strange that she'd be getting these very authentic seeming letters from these women if these women were also missing. And so eventually the police would leave and they would tell Leonardo that they would be in touch if they needed anything. And then over the next couple of days, Leonardo was very concerned about these three women, but she received numerous postcards from these women over those several days, and all of these postcards were totally normal seeming. And so Leonardo was fairly confident that whatever was going on with the police had to have been a mix-up, and she wouldn't be hearing from them again. But a couple of weeks later, the police did come back to Leonardo's house, except this time they didn't knock, they just barged right in. After the police had spoken with Leonardo that first time, they did some digging on these letters that she was receiving, and they managed to trace them all back to their start point. And it turned out all of these letters from all three of these women were originating from one place. It was this little town to the north of Correggio. And when police went to this little town, they discovered that these letters that were starting in this little town were all being mailed by the same person. And they got a physical description of this person who apparently was pretending to be these three women. And the description was of a tall, handsome young man with dark hair and dark eyes. It was Giuseppe. After the police barged into Leonardo's house, they went straight to Giuseppe's room where they accused him of murdering those three women, and then they hauled him out of the house and brought him to the station to question him about where he dumped the bodies. When the last police officer left Leonardo's house, Leonardo walked outside and just stood there wondering what she was going to do. It was like she had done everything in her power to protect her son from this curse, but somehow this curse she knew had done this to her son. And so now she knew there was only one thing she could do. Without saying anything to her husband, she went inside, she got her things, and she began making her way to the police station. At this point in her life, Leonardo looked much older than her actual age of 46. She had very gray hair, her face was very wrinkled, and she was stooped over, and she was always carrying these charm bags and magical potions and little stick figures that she claimed protected her family. And so her overall appearance when she wandered into the police station was that of a very frail old woman who was also very strange. And so Leonardo hobbled her way up to the front desk, and in a trembling voice, she asked the attendant if she could speak to the detective who was working on her son's case. And then a moment later, she was led into an interview room where she was told to wait. And then a little while later, the lead detective walked into the room, he sat down across the table from Leonardo, and he said, "What can I do for you?" And immediately, Leonardo said, "My son, Giuseppe, is innocent." And the detective, when he heard this, he was not remotely surprised. In fact, this is fully what he expected this conversation was going to be. He knew Leonardo loved her son very much, and of course she was going to say he was innocent. This is what parents typically did in cases like this. But the detective decided he wouldn't try to stop her. He would just let this very distraught mother kind of talk for a bit. He would tell her that he would follow up on whatever she was saying, and then he would drive her back home. But this detective was not expecting the things that would come out of Leonardo's mouth over the next couple of hours. In fact, her story about why Giuseppe was innocent was so shocking and so bizarre that the detective outright said, "I don't believe you. I don't believe this. This can't be true." And then other officers were called in to listen to her story to see if they believed it. And they too said, "This doesn't seem real." But the police would follow up on the details she gave, and it all checked out. It would turn out, back in late 1939, on the day that Faustina, the first woman that Leonardo pledged to help in order to get the universe to save her son, when Faustina was set to go north and meet her future husband, Faustina stopped by Leonardo's house to say bye. And when she was in Leonardo's house, something very unexpected happened. When Faustina walked into Leonardo's kitchen where Leonardo was, Faustina was so excited about meeting her potential future husband that her hands were shaking and she was smiling ear to ear. And so Leonardo said to Faustina, "Hey, you need to calm down." And so she handed Faustina a glass of wine. And so Faustina took the wine and she had a couple of sips of wine. And right away, Faustina started feeling dizzy. And before long, she was grabbing the table just to keep from falling over. It would turn out the wine was poisoned by Leonardo. And so Faustina, she's kind of looking up at Leonardo, and Leonardo is looking down at her, and she's got an axe in one of her hands. And she says to Faustina, "I'm so sorry." And then she winds up and she strikes Faustina in the chest with the axe and lodges it in her chest. And so she lets go of it, expecting Faustina to die. She doesn't. Faustina's just standing there with an axe in her chest. And so Leonardo grabbed the handle of the axe, she pulled it out of her chest, and then began wailing on her head over and over and over again until Faustina did fall to the ground dead. Then Leonardo lit a fire under her big metal pot on the stove, and then she cut Faustina's body into 9 pieces, she drained the blood out of the body into a bucket, and then she chucked those 9 pieces into the pot on the stove and began to mix them with caustic soda, which is a powerful dissolving agent that's used to make soap. And then she boiled the ingredients, her body parts and this caustic soda, for hours. Faustina's body slowly turned into this horrible black mush inside of this pot, and Leonardo was watching this the whole time, and she just had a look of total disappointment as this was happening. And then at some point, she just took the pot off the stove and dumped the ingredients, Faustina's body, down the septic tank. And then Leonardo waited for Faustina's blood that she had dumped out to coagulate, which means it became semi-solid, and then she heated it up in the oven and then ground it into flour. And she would use that flour to make tea cakes, which she fed to her friends the next day, as well as her son, Giuseppe. Leonardo also asked her son to mail some letters for her from the little town to the north where Faustina had supposedly gone. These letters, of course, were written by Leonardo pretending to be Faustina to give the impression that she was still alive and well. And Giuseppe, when he was told to go mail these letters, didn't think anything of it. He was used to doing errands for his mom. Even though Leonardo basically got away with killing Faustina, her plan for Faustina had not really gone the way Leonardo had hoped. When she boiled Faustina's chopped up body parts and this caustic soda, they didn't really mix the way she wanted them to. Leonardo was convinced that the reason for this is because Faustina was too skinny, and so there wasn't enough fat on her body for the mix to be perfect. So Leonardo had come up with another elaborate story, this time for another woman, Francesca, about that job in Switzerland she got through her mother's rich family. Of course, none of that was true, and when Francesca came by Leonardo's house to say goodbye to her, she was offered a glass of poisoned wine, and after she sipped from it, she became dizzy, and then Leonardo showed up with an axe and hacked Francesca to death. But again, when the body parts and the caustic soda were in the pot on the stove boiling together, they were still not coming together the way Leonardo wanted. And so again, Leonardo, with a look of disgust, just dumped the pot down the septic tank and wound up making tea cakes from Francesca's blood. Then the next day, she fed those tea cakes to her friends, as well as Giuseppe, and she also asked Giuseppe to send a few more letters from up north. These letters were, of course, from Francesca. Still feeling totally unsatisfied with how the last 2 killings had gone, Leonardo moved on to her third target, her best friend, Virginia. And this time, when Virginia came by Leonardo's house to say goodbye, everything went to plan. Leonardo was able to poison Virginia, she killed her with the axe, she chopped her up, she put her in the pot, and this time, the 9 chunks of her body mixed beautifully with the caustic soda. And so after adding a few fine perfumes into the pot, Leonardo was finally able to create the thing that she had not been able to create with the other 2 women's bodies. And that was a beautiful, rich, creamy bar of soap. She also, again, made tea cakes from Virginia's blood. That night, when Giuseppe came home, Leonarda demanded that she be allowed to bathe him with her magic soap, i.e. the soap made from Virginia's body. And so she did that. She scrubbed him with Virginia's body soap. And then while she was doing that, she fed him the tea cakes that were made from Virginia's blood. It would turn out Leonarda did in fact believe that in order to save her son from this curse, she would need to give something beautiful to the universe. And at first, she really had believed that the way to do that was by helping the people of Correggio above and beyond anything she had ever done before. But at some point during her interactions with Faustina, the first woman, Leonarda had decided that, you know what, that wasn't enough. She really needed to make sure that her son was going to be safe. And so the only way really that Leonarda could guarantee her son would be safe would be if she actually took a life and gave that back to the universe. That would save her son. The reason Leonarda wound up taking 3 lives and not just 1 life is because she also decided that as an extra protective measure, she wanted to make sure that she actually bathed her son, literally, in the body parts and kind of essence of the life she had taken. And so that's where the idea of the soap came in. However, the first 2 women, their body parts didn't mix right, and so she couldn't turn them into soap. But then Virginia came along and her body did mix with the caustic soda. And so Leonarda was able to make her soap. She was able to bathe her son with Virginia's body and feed him Virginia's blood. And so in Leonarda's mind, she had done everything she could to protect her son at that point. Leonarda would ultimately be sentenced to 30 years in prison, as well as 3 years in an insane asylum, just as the fortune teller had predicted. Leonarda died in 1970 when she was 76 years old. As for her family, they fled Correggio, and 3 of her children changed their names and vanished. And her prized son, Giuseppe, who she had killed to protect, had gone on to join the military and he would go to war, and he either was killed in combat or simply changed his name and vanished as well.
All the walls are breathing slowly. Cracks like rivers trace the night. Shadows fold around the memory of a love that wouldn't die. I hear your name inside the static, a ghost that moves beneath the glass.
Thank you for listening to the Mr. Ballin podcast. If you enjoyed today's story and you're looking for more strange, dark, and mysterious content, be sure to check out all of the Ballin Studios podcasts. We have this one, the main show, and we also have Mr. Ballen's Medical Mysteries, we have Bedtime Stories, and we have Run Fool. You can find all of these podcasts simply by searching for Ballin Studios wherever you listen to your podcasts. Also, there are hundreds more stories like the one you heard today that are in video format on our YouTube channel, and that channel is just called Mr. Ballin.